All right, and welcome into the third part of the tutorial where we're going to take a look at exposing a ton of parameters for this material and trying to seamlessly blend them into the pipeline that we've essentially created for our base material. So the first one that I want to do is I want to go ahead and allow for a slider to basically expose various areas of our material here. So actually removing scales and then creating an underside for these scales with a little bit of like tissue and visceral sinew that we're going to be able to see on our material as if the scales were physically removed by force. So where I want to do all of this is actually right at the beginning here, because like I had shown you in the previous tutorial, when we play around with this node, everything just seems to fall into line to intuitively update our material and basically operate and execute all of the subsequent nodes to make it look as if it fits organically onto our material. So what I'm going to do is we're going to try and have to figure out a way to basically mask off these scales. And so what I'm going to start with is I'm going to bring this guy back just a little bit, and I'm going to bring these guys over here. And so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to find a way that we can basically create a slider to slide through the ranges of these scales to just randomly mask them on or off. And one way we can do that is using another flood fill node. And you're going to probably see what we're doing here in just a second as I bring more space into the situation. But because we've got very defined shapes here, I'm going to be able to fit this nicely into a flood fill. And like we've done in the past, we're going to be able to use a flood fill to random grayscale. And so immediately in just two nodes, we've basically created the basis for what we're going to need to create this slider. And so you can see that we've got a bunch of different grayscale ranges that we're going to be able to cycle through. And we need one more node that's going to allow us to actually expose this slider that I keep talking about. And you can probably guess what it is. We've used it a couple of times in this series alone, and it's going to be the histogram scan node. And you can see that as I plug this in, we're not going to get anything, but as we shift the position up, you can see that some of our scales start to appear. And now this is going to allow us to expose this slider right here. And then we're going to be able to drag this up or down once we expose it to create kind of like a scale slider. Now, one of the problems you can see here is that we're going to get very gradiated positioning because we've got a whole bunch of different grayscale values, not just black and white. And so one more thing that I want to do with this node is I want to make sure the contrast is 100%, because I don't want any grayscale values when using this, because it's going to be a binary mask. Do we have a scale in this area, or do we not have a scale? It's going to be either a yes or a no. And so I'm going to bring this down. And again, I'm going to bring this way back just so we have some more room to work with. And so now I'm going to add a blend, and I'm going to use this as our opacity. Now what I want to use over top is just going to be a uniform grayscale node. And again, we have to set this to grayscale mode because we're working in grayscale. And I'm going to plug in our edge detect into this guy here. And I want to make sure that I just plug this guy in over top, just to make sure that any areas that we are masking off with this histogram are going to be masked off with black in our final blend. And for efficiency's sake, I want to make sure that this is not a 2K node. So I'm going to go up to absolute and bring this down. And that's looking pretty good. So now I'm just going to shift click this guy and to steal it. And so now you can see immediately what we're going to get is a nice slider that's going to allow us to mask off a bunch of these scales. Okay, and so now we've got our mask that we're able to use to basically just organically slide between the amounts of scales on our material. But what next? What do we do? Well, we need to basically use this mask and we need to redefine the areas where there's no scales, because right now all it's doing is it's removing the scales and then blending between our different heights. So we need to come down into the skin portion of our material, and we need to just basically refactor it so that we have kind of like an underside to these scales. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, and I'm going to bring these guys down into the corner here. And so again, nothing really has changed. We've just got these blending in with our scale subtraction where we do have scales, but you can see that now in the areas where we don't have scales, there's no subtraction. So we need to create a subtraction of our own. So I'm going to create a crystal 2 node. And this is going to be the basis of kind of like our tendons. You can kind of see it kind of looks like tendons in certain areas. So we're going to manipulate it a little bit so that it looks a little bit more than just a little bit like tendons. And what I want to do right now is I'm going to add a blend node to this. And I'm going to plug this guy in. And so from there, I'm going to use this just so that we can see a live update of what is happening to our material. So I'm going to take this crystal 2 and I'm going to add a directional scratches over top of it. And so if we blend these two together, what I'm trying to accomplish is that I want these to be kind of like smaller fibrils of the larger tendons. So we can think of these as just a larger and smaller scale muscle, essentially. And so I'm going to bring this to 90 degrees so that we've got it coming up and down. I'm also going to bring the scale up to like around 7-ish, just so we get a lot of smaller information. And right now it's not looking too hot, but please, bear with me. It's going to look much better. And I also want to make the scale of these tendons something like 5 or 6, just so they're a little bit smaller. So now with this blending mode, I'm going to come down and I'm going to switch it to max lighten. And you can see that we're going to basically just have some of our lighter areas of our smaller fibrils kind of coming through. And I'm just going to decrease this down to something like 0.35, something like that. Maybe have a little bit on the angle random. I might bring this up just a little bit more. And so this is going to really just be the basis for what our muscles are going to look like. And so now what I want to do is I want to add a little bit more directionality to these. So I'm going to add a directional warp. And what I'm going to use for the intensity is just going to be this mask over here, because at this point in time, this is the only mask that we have that is in these exact areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a blur high quality grayscale just to get a little bit of a gradient for this. And this is going to be what we're plugging in to the intensity of our directional warp. And so now you can see that what it's going to do is just kind of like warp these around just a little bit. We can play around with the intensity. play around with the direction as well. And so now I want to just soften these out. And so I'm going to use just a normal blur. Bring this right down. Something like 0.35 maybe. Yeah, just a little bit softer. And then I'm going to add a histogram range onto this guy, just like we did for our skin down here, just so that we get a nice kind of overall control for this particular geometry. And so I'm going to basically maintain that range. And then I'm going to also bring the position way up to about 0.8. And so now what we need to do is we need to mask off the areas with which we're actually having this kind of like muscle show up. And so I'm going to go ahead and use our blur here and just plug that guy in first. And so you can see immediately what we're going to do is we're going to have kind of that sinew show up, that muscle, only in the areas where we've got no scales. But it's not really working too great because of the blur. So I'm going to use a curve node, and we're going to just kind of correct that up, shape it up a little bit. So you can see that if I kind of increase our values here, we're going to essentially just have it showing up intermittently across our material. And you can see what it's doing in here if we take a look at the blend. So we've got it showing up in the correct areas now, but we're going to need to pretty much do exactly what we've done here and just now subtract some value from this so that we actually get a little bit of a divot or a crater in where the areas of our scales would have been. So we're going to add another blend node. And I'm going to go ahead and just steal this black value. I'm going to plug this in over top. And so we're going to get nothing right now. But I'm going to control duplicate this curves node here because I'm going to use this as our mask. And so you can see right now it's basically just completely removed this area from our material. There we go. So I don't want it to be that dark. So what I'm going to do is we're just going to play around with our curve editor here. And I'm also going to play around with the opacity. And so I want to kind of leave a little bit of a lip along those sides there. So we're going to just kind of fiddle around with our curve here. And so it took a little bit of finagling. So I'll just go ahead and I'll show you what I did. So I've got our blend on opacity of 0.55. I took the curves and I brought, just you can see, I kind of just brought the cut in just a little bit so that it's only kind of affecting more towards the center of our material here. And then I've gone ahead and actually changed the position of our histogram range here, and I'm going to bring it down to something like 0.75. And so that's going to give us some nice cuts right into our material there, kind of where our scales would have been. And so now that we've pretty much got the geometry done for our, I guess, missing scales, we can go ahead and start working on the albedo. And so I'm going to take this guy here, and we're going to use this for our gradient map. So when I plug this guy in, I'm going to bring him back up to the very start of our albedo here. I'm going to extend this back a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do this before we blend together the scales and the skin. I'm going to blend these ones together as well. So when I do that, everything's going to change a little bit. And we're going to need to mask off these areas in here. And so if we come back down, we can find that we've basically created a perfect mask for ourselves right here. So if we just take this guy here, bring him up, we immediately have a pretty good mask actually. So I'm going to use that guy there. And I'm going to start coloring kind of the nice meatier areas of our flesh here. Again, using just different kinds of reds. I want to make sure that we're getting relatively darker colors. Maybe I want to come back down and just play a little bit with the geometry here. If we take a look at our histogram, see if we bring this down to 0.7. Maybe put this to 0.6, just so we get a little bit more of the kind of like tendony, fleshy parts. That's starting to look pretty good. So come back up to our albedo here. And again, it's all really just a guessing game and kind of like whatever works well with your eye. I think that looks pretty good. Looks not too fresh, but definitely not dried out. We can go into our opacity here, maybe bump this down to like 0.85. And that's looking pretty good. So now what happens when we come into our parameter over here, if we bring this guy down, we've basically masked off none of our scales, and it just operates like how we originally created the material. And you can see that as we work our way towards the top of our histogram here, it's going to start to unmask, or sorry, mask off parts of our scales. However, you can see that we run into one tiny issue where we don't really get the patterns on the outsides of the scales here. And so this is because we've actually had an issue in here. It took me it took me way too long to figure out what the issue was. So when we decided to use a blur to help warp these guys here, our blur was a little bit too strong, so that all of these are kind of blurring into each other. So if we bring this down to something like 2.5, we should be able to get the skin layers just kind of showing up again. And depending on how low you put this, you'll get more solid or smoother transitions. So now if we come back to our histogram scan here, you can see that we can go from the initial material that we've created, and as we work our way through the positioning, we can detract any random order or assortment of our scales to a point where we've basically just completely removed all of our scales here. So this is the flexibility of playing around with our different parameters. Is going to allow us to get basically a whole secondary material. And so the last thing I want to expose is a pretty simple fix, and that's why I kind of just left it to the end. I want to go ahead and expose a parameter that's going to allow us to alter the coloring of the scales. And so if we come into here where we've got our scale base color, you can see that as I shift around on the hue, it's going to essentially just alter the hue or the color of our scales, but it's going to keep all of that surface information that we've created down the chain here. And that's why I use a lot of different blending modes such as overlay and multiply, because it's going to maintain the integrity of the hue for the most part, but it's going to allow us to play around with the hue later on and still provide accurate surfacing information. And so all we need to do for this guy here is I'm going to right click and go to expose parameters. And you can see now that this is going to open up a pop-up window. And this is going to be the only parameter that we have for this node. Some other nodes have quite a few parameters that we can use. So I'm just going to check this guy here. And because we're not really exposing any other parameters, we don't need to give it any special kind of name. Output color will be just fine. So I'm going to hit OK. And you can see now that if we click on this node, we can't actually play around with the output color. And that's because we have to double click in our graph area, anywhere in our graph that's not a node. And if we scroll down to input parameters, this is where all of our information has gone. So now we can play around with the hue, change the saturation and the value or the lightness, depending on your terminology. And we can, by default, create this as our new standard for our texture. So I'm going to leave the identifier. I'm going to leave the editor type. And I'm going to come down to label. And label is what is going to be acknowledged by us people when we are using this. So this is going to be the label or the title of what this parameter is. And so I'm just going to call this scale color. And so that's going to be our scale color. I also want to come back to our mask over here. And I'm going to go ahead and we can also come into the parameters here and we can click on this drop down and hit expose. And so this is basically just another drop down window for the same exact thing. If we were to just go right click and expose parameters. So for this, again, all I want is the position slider. This is the only slider I want. So I'm going to click on position. Again, we only have one position we're going to be exposing. So I'm going to just leave that as it is and hit OK. And now we're not going to get access to that because we have to, once again, come into our base graph. And now we have position. And so now this is where we're going to be able to control exposing our underside of our scales there. So by default, I'm going to leave this at 0. We can change the minimum value and the maximum value. However, I'm going to leave it at 0 and 1. And we can think of this as percent. So 0% or 100%. The step is going to be how much we can increment on the slider. So right now it's set to 0.01. So you can see that I can get very, very small numbers, basically, 10%, 12%, 14. what is that? 58%. But I don't want to be able to get, smaller, very fine numbers because they don't really make that much of a difference. So instead, I want to increment by 10% or zero point 0.1. So now when we come up to this little eye, which is going to allow us to preview our parameters, you can see that we have our scale color. So we can play around with that. And our position. And when I increase our position, it's going to snap to every 10% or 0.1 on our slider. And this is going to be super handy because, one, we can create entirely new materials, and the parameters that we've exposed are not going to affect each other. You can see that the hue, the scale color value here, is only affecting the scales. So this is the power of Substance Designer and exposing such parameters that we can actually use this in real time in an animation suite or a game engine. So now that we have pretty much finished the basis for our original material and created almost an entirely separate material with our two exposed parameters, I want to go ahead and export this to be used in an application that allows us to utilize these parameters. So I'm going to come up to where my graph is, and I'm going to click on the package. So the package is able to store multiple graphs inside of it, but in this case, we've only done one graph. So I'm going to click on the package, and I'm going to click on this little arrow up top here, and this is going to allow us to publish our selected element or our package. So when I click on that, I'm going to go to my folder where I want to save this, and I'm going to call it scales. And we want to save it as a .sbsar. And the .sbsar file is going to allow us to basically bring it into any kind of game engine that supports these files, and we're going to be able to use it with the exposed parameters in real time. So we're going to be shown this little pop-up here as well. So everything should be good by default. And we'll hit OK. And now we've published our exposed material. So thanks for checking out these tutorials, guys. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in a future tutorial.